The morning of April 12, 1945, broke cold and metallic over Iwo Jima. Captain Robert "Bob" Fitzgerald stood on the volcanic black sand, staring at his aircraft, a Boeing B-29 Superfortress nicknamed Lonesome Lady. She was a monster of aluminum and ambition, weighing 140,000 pounds fully loaded, stretching 99 feet long with a 141-foot wingspan that cast shadows like the hand of God. The B-29 was America's most advanced bomber, a pressurized fortress that could fly higher and farther than anything the Japanese had. 4 Wright R-3350 engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, hung from her wings like the beating hearts of industrial warfare. Inside her belly, 12,000 pounds of incendiary bombs destined for a chemical plant outside Tokyo. Fitzgerald's crew of 11 men moved through their pre-flight checklist with the mechanical precision of men who knew that one mistake at 30,000 feet meant death. Staff Sergeant James "Jimmy" Chen, the flight engineer, ran his hands along the engine cowlings, checking for oil leaks. His family had been relocated to an internment camp in California 3 years earlier. Now he was flying missions to destroy the land of his ancestors. War made strange arithmetic of loyalty. "She's good, Captain," Chen called out, his breath fogging in the dawn air. Lieutenant Frank Morrison, the co-pilot, climbed aboard through the forward hatch. He was 23 years old and had already flown 18 missions over Japan. His hands didn't shake anymore when the flak started. That worried him more than the shaking ever had. In the tail gunner position, 30 feet behind the cockpit, Sergeant Billy Crawford settled into his isolated perch. The tail gun station was a transparent bubble of plexiglass, a lonely throne suspended in the sky. Crawford was the eyes in the back of the formation, the man who would see the enemy fighters before anyone else. He checked his twin .50 caliber machine guns, chambering rounds with a metallic snap that echoed through the fuselage. The briefing had been stark. 127 B-29s would strike Tokyo in broad daylight. Intelligence reported diminished Japanese fighter resistance, but everyone knew intelligence had been wrong before. The skies over Japan belonged to the Mitsubishi A6M0, the Nakajima Ki-84 Frank, and the Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony, aircraft flown by pilots who had nothing left to lose. At 0642 hours, Lonesome Lady lifted off from Iwo Jima, her engines screaming defiance at gravity. Fitzgerald held the yoke steady as the bomber clawed for altitude, joining the massive formation that stretched across the Pacific sky like a migration of metal birds. The sun climbed behind them, setting their wings ablaze with reflected light. 4 hours into the flight, the Japanese coastline appeared, a dark smudge against the horizon that grew into mountains, cities, and the intricate geometry of human civilization about to be set on fire. The bomb bay doors groaned open. Wind screamed through the fuselage at 220 miles per hour. "Bomb run in 3 minutes, Morrison announced, his voice steady over the intercom. That's when the flak started. Black flowers bloomed in the sky, 88mm anti-aircraft shells detonating in patterns designed by mathematics and hatred. The first explosion rocked Lonesome Lady like a slap from God. Shrapnel punched through the aluminum skin with sounds like hammers on sheet metal. An 88mm shell exploded 15 feet below the nose, sending razor-sharp fragments through the bombardier station. Lieutenant David Kern, the bombardier, grunted once and slumped over his Norden bomb sight. Blood pooled on the plexiglass floor beneath him. Tech Sergeant Ray Murphy, the navigator, crawled forward and pressed his hands against the wound in Kern's chest, feeling the hot pulse of arterial blood between his fingers. "Bombardiers hit! Bombardiers down!" Murphy shouted into his throat mic. But the mission was already in motion. The target filled the crosshairs of the bomb sight. At 0847 hours, 12,000 pounds of M69 incendiary clusters fell from Lonesome Lady's belly, tumbling toward the chemical plant that produced aviation fuel for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Then the fighters came. Crawford saw them first, 6 Nakajima Ki-84 Franks climbing hard from below, their engines screaming, 20mm cannons spitting fire. These weren't the older Zeros the Americans had learned to defeat. The Frank was fast, 392 miles per hour at altitude, and heavily armed. Its pilots were among the last of Japan's combat veterans, men who flew with the fury of a dying nation. Fighters. 6 o'clock low. Coming up fast. Crawford's voice cracked across the intercom. The lead Frank pilot, Flight Sergeant Takeo Yamada, had already shot down 3 B-29s in his career. He knew exactly where to aim. The engines. Kill an engine, and the superfortress became a wounded whale, easy prey for the pack. Yamada's first burst caught Lonesome Lady's No. 3 engine, the inboard engine on the right wing. 20mm explosive rounds shredded the cowling, punctured fuel lines, and ignited aviation gas in a gout of orange flame that streamed backward like a comet's tail. Inside the cockpit, every warning light on Fitzgerald's panel lit up red. The fire alarm bell clanged with mechanical urgency. The B-29 shuddered, yawing hard to the right as the burning engine lost power. "Engine 3 is on fire," Chan shouted, already hitting the fire suppression system. CO2 flooded the engine compartment, smothering the flames, but the engine was dead, a 2,200 horsepower weight dragging on the wing. Morrison feathered the propeller, turning the blade's edge on to reduce drag. The formation was already pulling away, leaving Lonesome Lady isolated and vulnerable, exactly what the Japanese fighters wanted. The second Frank made its run. This pilot, Warrant Officer Kenji Sato, aimed for the tail. His 20mm rounds walked up the fuselage like a zipper of destruction, punching through aluminum, severing hydraulic lines, and shattering the plexiglass of Crawford's gun turret. Crawford felt something hot slash across his shoulder and knew he was hit, but his guns were still working, and that was all that mattered. He fired back, 2.50 caliber machine guns hammering in synchronized fury, tracers marking red lines across the sky. His rounds caught Sato's Frank in the wing root, sparking off the metal, and the Japanese fighter broke away trailing smoke. But the damage was done. "Lost hydraulics," Morrison called out, scanning his instruments. "I've got no pressure on the rudder. Elevator control is sluggish. We're losing her." Fitzgerald fought the controls. The yoke felt heavy, unresponsive, like steering a truck through mud. The B-29 wanted to spiral into a death dive, and only his physical strength on the yoke kept her level. "How bad?" Fitzgerald demanded. Morrison didn't sugarcoat it. "Bad, Skip. Real bad. We've got maybe 50% control authority. Rudder's shot. If we lose anything else, we're going down." Behind them, the 4 remaining Franks regrouped for another pass. Lonesome Lady was alone, crippled, 400 miles from safety, flying on 3 engines with half her flight controls destroyed. And the hunters were closing in. The Pacific wind screamed through the holes in Lonesome Lady's fuselage, a chorus of whistling destruction that made communication nearly impossible. Captain Fitzgerald's hands were locked on the yoke, every muscle in his arms burning as he fought to keep the crippled bomber level. Without proper hydraulic pressure, the control surfaces responded sluggishly, requiring twice the force to execute even basic maneuvers. "Fighters coming around again. 3 o'clock high." Sergeant Tom Riley, the right waist gunner, called out. His voice was tight with adrenaline. The Nakajima Key, 84 Franks came in like wolves testing wounded prey. Flight Sergeant Yamada led the formation, his engine howling as he dove toward Lonesome Lady's starboard side. He'd shot down 17 Allied aircraft in his career, a number that would mean nothing if Japan lost the war, but everything if he could keep his honor intact until the end. Yamada's tactical mind calculated angles and deflection. The B-29's defensive armament was formidable, up to 12.50 caliber machine guns mounted in remote-controlled turrets, but a crippled bomber couldn't maneuver, couldn't evade. It was a matter of patience and precision. He opened fire at 800 yards. The 20mm cannon rounds arced through the sky, brilliant tracers marking their path. Most missed, passing harmlessly through the space where the B-29 had been moments before, but 4 rounds hammered into the right wing. One punched through the main spar, the structural backbone of the wing, creating a stress fracture that would worsen with every vibration. Inside the cockpit, Fitzgerald felt the impact like a hammer blow. "We're hit again. Right wing." Lieutenant Morrison scanned the wing through his side window, watching fuel vapor stream from a punctured tank. "We're venting fuel. Tank 3 is leaking." Sergeant Chen was already on it, transferring fuel from the damaged tank to the reserves, balancing the bomber's weight distribution to prevent a catastrophic fire. His hands moved across the engineer's panel with the speed of desperation and the precision of training. One wrong valve, one miscalculation, and they'd explode. In the tail gun position, Billy Crawford ignored the blood soaking through his jacket and tracked another Frank coming in from 6 o'clock. The Japanese pilot, Warrant Officer Sato, his Frank trailing smoke from Crawford's earlier hit, was making a vengeance run, determined to kill the gunner who'd wounded his aircraft. Crawford waited. His father had been a hunter in Montana, and he'd taught young Billy the most important lesson: never waste ammunition. Wait for the shot. The Frank grew larger in his gun sight. 500 yards. 400. 300. No. Crawford pressed both triggers. The twin .50 calibers roared, their recoil shaking the entire tail assembly. 50 rounds per second, each bullet weighing nearly 2 ounces, traveling at 2,900 feet per second. The stream of fire converged on Sato's Frank like a river of steel. The first rounds shattered the Frank's canopy. The next punched through the engine cowling. The pilot slumped forward, and the fighter went into a flat spin, corkscrewing toward the Pacific Ocean 8 miles below. Crawford watched it fall until it disappeared into the clouds. "Splash 1," he reported, his voice hoarse. But there were still 3 Franks circling, and Lonesome Lady was losing altitude. "Skip, we're down to 14,000 feet, Morrison reported. "We're losing 100 feet per minute. With 3 engines, we can't maintain altitude." Fitzgerald knew the mathematics. At this rate of descent, they'd be at sea level in 140 minutes, long before they could reach Iwo Jima. And down low, they'd be even more vulnerable to the fighters, who could dive on them with impunity. "Chen, can you give me anything more from the engines?" Fitzgerald asked. "They're already at max continuous power, Captain. If I push them harder, we'll burn them out." Fitzgerald made the decision that every bomber captain dreaded. Dump the ammunition. Dump everything that's not bolted down. We need to lighten the load. Throughout the fuselage, the crew sprang into action. Thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition were thrown out through the open waste gun ports, bright brass cartridges tumbling toward the ocean like metallic rain. Toolboxes, spare parts, even personal items followed. Private First Class Danny O'Connor, the radio operator, hesitated over a photograph of his wife and daughter, then kissed it and tossed it out. Survival mattered more than sentiment. The B-29 climbed slightly, barely 200 feet, but it was something. Yamada watched from 2,000 feet above, analyzing the situation with the cold clarity of a veteran warrior. The American bomber was wounded, losing fuel, struggling to maintain altitude. Its formation had long since abandoned it. Protocol dictated he press the attack until the enemy was destroyed. But his own Frank was running low on fuel and ammunition. He had perhaps one more pass before he'd have to break off and return to base. His 2 remaining wingmen were in similar condition. The mathematics of aerial combat were unforgiving. He keyed his radio. One more attack run. Aim for the cockpit. Kill the pilots. It was the oldest tactic in aerial warfare. Cut off the head and the body dies. The 3 Franks climbed, gaining altitude and energy for a high-speed diving attack. They would come in at over 400 miles per hour, fire one concentrated burst into the cockpit area, and break away. If the pilots died, the B-29 would spiral into the ocean, and they could return home with honor. In Lonesome Lady's cockpit, Morrison saw the fighters positioning. They're setting up for a head-on pass. Fitzgerald understood immediately. A head-on attack was devastating because the combined closure rate, the bomber's speed plus the fighter's speed, gave gunners less than 2 seconds to engage. But it was also dangerous for the fighters, who had to fly directly into the bomber's forward guns. "Ray, get on the nose guns," Fitzgerald ordered. Navigator Ray Murphy scrambled into the bombardier's position, stepping over Lieutenant Kern's body. The Norden bomb sight had been shattered by shrapnel, but the twin .50 caliber guns in the nose turret were still operational. Murphy had never fired the nose guns in combat before. He was a navigator, not a gunner, but he understood the principle: point and shoot. The three Franks dove like raptors. Yamada led the formation, his fighter's nose pointed directly at Lonesome Lady's cockpit. Through his gun sight, he could see the pilot's silhouettes. In 3 seconds, they'd be in range. Murphy's hands found the gun controls. The twin barrels tracked upward, following the diving fighters. 2 seconds. Fitzgerald saw them coming. 3 fighters in echelon formation, their propellers spinning discs of reflected sunlight, gun muzzles already flickering with fire. He couldn't evade. With degraded controls and 3 engines, any aggressive maneuver would send them into a spin. "Brace!" he shouted. Murphy opened fire. 1 second. The sky erupted in a storm of metal. The Franks fired their 20mm cannons and 12.7mm machine guns. Lonesome Lady's nose guns hammered back. The combined firepower was enough to destroy a building. Yamada's rounds hit first. They shredded the bomber's nose cone, punched through the plexiglass, and tore into the instrument panel. Sparks exploded across the cockpit. One round missed Fitzgerald's head by inches and buried itself in the bulkhead behind him. Another severed hydraulic lines, spraying both pilots with red fluid that looked sickeningly like blood. Morrison screamed as a shell fragment slashed across his thigh, opening a wound that spurted arterial blood. But Murphy's guns found their mark. His first burst caught Yamada's Frank in the engine. The second shattered the propeller, sending blade fragments slicing through the cowling. The fighter's engine seized, stopped, and the Frank became a 20-foot glider traveling at 400 miles per hour with nowhere to go. Yamada fought the controls, trying to clear the bomber, but momentum was unforgiving. His left wing clipped Lonesome Lady's right wing with a sound like a car crash in the sky. Metal screamed. Both aircraft shuddered. Yamada's Frank cartwheeled away, spinning toward the ocean. The B-29's right wing buckled, the spar fracture widening into a crack visible from the cockpit. "We're going down," Morrison shouted, pressing his hands against his bleeding leg. Lonesome Lady rolled right, the damaged wing dropping, the bomber spiraling toward a death dive that would tear her apart before she hit the water. Fitzgerald hauled back on the yoke with every ounce of strength he possessed. His vision tunneled. His heart hammered. The artificial horizon on his instrument panel spun uselessly. The ocean filled the windscreen. "Come on, baby," Fitzgerald whispered through clenched teeth. "Come on." The B-29 shuddered, groaned, and began to level out. 1,000 feet above the Pacific, Lonesome Lady pulled out of the dive. Behind them, the 2 remaining Franks broke off the attack, their fuel exhausted, their ammunition spent. They turned for home, leaving the crippled bomber to its fate. But Lonesome Lady was still flying. Barely. Silence hung in the cockpit of Lonesome Lady like smoke after an explosion. Not true silence, but the relative quiet after the thunder of combat, broken only by the irregular thrumming of 3 laboring engines and the whistle of wind through hundreds of bullet holes. The smell was overwhelming. Aviation fuel, hydraulic fluid, burned metal, blood, and the acrid stench of electrical fires that had been smothered but not forgotten. Captain Robert Fitzgerald's arms trembled from exhaustion. He'd been wrestling the controls for 40 minutes since the fighter attack, and the B-29 fought him every second. With the rudder hydraulics destroyed, he had to use differential engine power to control direction, throttling engines up and down to steer, a technique normally reserved for ground emergencies, now being performed at 200 miles per hour, 8,000 feet above a hostile ocean. Lieutenant Frank Morrison sat beside him, his flight suit soaked with blood from the thigh wound. Sergeant Chen had tied a tourniquet above the injury, a length of parachute cord twisted tight with a screwdriver, but Morrison was pale, sweating despite the cold, and his hands shook on the co-pilot's controls. "How you holding up, Frank?" Fitzgerald asked, not taking his eyes from the damaged wing. "Been better, Skip." Morrison's voice was weak but steady. "Been worse too. That poker game in Manila after my third mission, now that was bad." It was a lie told for courage, and both men knew it, but courage built from lies was still courage. Behind them, through the narrow tunnel that connected the cockpit to the rest of the fuselage, the crew worked with desperate efficiency. Tech Sergeant Ray Murphy had pulled Lieutenant Kern's body from the bombardier station and covered it with a canvas tarp. There was no time for prayers or ceremony. The dead could wait. The living needed saving. Sergeant Jimmy Chan stood at the engineer's panel, monitoring engine temperatures that were climbing toward critical levels. The three remaining Wright R-3350 engines were running at maximum continuous power, a setting designed to be used for minutes, not hours. Number 1 engine's cylinder head temperature was 285 degrees Celsius, dangerously close to the 290-degree threshold where components would begin to fail. "Captain, I need to reduce power on number 1, Chen reported. "She's cooking herself." "Can't do it, Jimmy. We're barely maintaining altitude as is. If we reduce power, we'll be in the water in 20 minutes. Chen understood. He also understood that if the engine seized or caught fire, they'd be in the water in 2 minutes. He made a decision every flight engineer dreaded. He would let the engine destroy itself slowly, buying time measured in degrees and minutes, gambling that they'd reach land before the metal gave up. In the waist gun positions, Sergeants Tom Riley and Mike Santos worked to seal the holes in the fuselage. They used anything they could find: duct tape, canvas, even pages torn from technical manuals, wadded up and jammed into the larger punctures. It was futile engineering, like trying to patch a sinking ship with paper, but doing something was better than waiting to die. Billy Crawford remained in the tail gun position, scanning the sky for more fighters despite the blood loss that made his vision swim. His shoulder wound had stopped bleeding. Shock and cold had done what first aid couldn't, but every movement sent fire through his body. He kept scanning anyway. That was the job. Private Danny O'Connor worked the radio, broadcasting their position and condition on the emergency frequency, knowing that any Japanese listening post within 200 miles could hear him and vector more fighters toward them. But protocols existed for a reason, and the protocol was clear: a damaged aircraft broadcasts continuously. "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday! This is Lonesome Lady, tail number 427, approximately 300 miles east of Shikoku, altitude 8,000 feet and descending, 3 engines operational, requesting emergency assistance." Mayday! 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 Only static answered. The Pacific stretched beneath them, gray and infinite and utterly indifferent to human struggle. No islands. No rescue ships. Just water from horizon to horizon, cold enough to kill an unprotected man in 90 minutes. Morrison checked their navigation, cross-referencing the radio compass with dead reckoning. His leg throbbed with each heartbeat, but his mind remained sharp. "Skip, at our current speed and rate of descent, we'll reach Iwo Jima at approximately 3,000 feet. Maybe less. Can we make the runway?" Morrison did the math silently. Runway 28 at Iwo Jima was 6,000 feet long, barely adequate for a healthy B-29, completely inadequate for one with damaged controls and a cracked wing spar. "No guarantees," Morrison said finally. "But it's better odds than ditching." Fitzgerald nodded. Ditching a B-29 in open ocean was theoretically survivable, The aircraft had been designed with a boat-like hull, but theoretical survival and actual survival were separated by cold water, injuries, sharks, and the simple fact that the Pacific Ocean was very large and rescue aircraft were very small. 30 minutes passed. Then 45. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature inside the unpressurized, ventilated fuselage dropped toward freezing. Men's breath fogged. Fingers went numb. Chen watched number 1 engine's temperature climb past 290 degrees. At 295, he saw the first wisps of smoke trailing from the cowling. At 298, the oil pressure began to fluctuate. At 300 degrees, the temperature at which aluminum components begin to lose structural integrity, he made the call. "Captain, I have to shut down number 1. She's about to seize." Fitzgerald closed his eyes briefly. 2 engines. Half their power. No altitude to spare. Do it. Chen pulled the mixture control to idle cutoff and shut down the fuel flow. The engine coughed once and died. The propeller windmilled briefly, then Chen feathered it, the blades turning edge-on to reduce drag. Lonesome Lady immediately began to descend faster. "We're sinking, Skip," Morrison reported. 300 feet per minute. At that rate, they had 20 minutes before they hit the water. Fitzgerald didn't respond. He was too busy fighting the yoke. With only 2 engines running, both on the left wing, the bomber wanted to fly in circles. He had to hold constant right pressure, his arms locked, his shoulders screaming, maintaining a course through pure physical strength. "Distance to Iwo?" he asked. 60 miles. 60 miles. 18 minutes at 200 miles per hour. They'd be underwater before they arrived. Unless... "Chen, give me emergency war power on the remaining engines." Chen's eyes widened. "Captain, emergency war power is only authorized for..." "I know what it's authorized for." "Do it." Emergency war power was a setting that existed in the R-3350 engine's design but was almost never used. It involved increasing the manifold pressure and RPM beyond normal operational limits, generating maximum thrust at the cost of catastrophic engine wear. It could increase power by 15% for approximately 10 minutes before the engines destroyed themselves. 10 minutes. It would have to be enough. Chen advanced the throttles past their normal stops, engaging the emergency override. The 2 remaining engines screamed, their note climbing from a roar to a shriek. The bomber surged forward, clawing for altitude. 7,000 feet. 7,500. Morrison watched the coastline materialize on the horizon, a dark line between gray ocean and gray sky. Visual contact with Iwo Jima. "Iwo Tower, this is Lonesome Lady," O'Connor transmitted. "Inbound emergency. 2 engines. Damaged controls. Request priority landing." The reply crackled back immediately. "Lonesome Lady, Iwo Tower. You are cleared for straight-in approach runway 28. Fire and rescue standing by. Be advised, strong crosswind at 10 knots, gusting 15. Crosswind. With no rudder control. It might as well have been a hurricane." Fitzgerald lined up for the approach, 6,000 feet above the volcanic island, 7 miles out. The runway was barely visible, a slash of concrete against black sand. He began the descent. 5,000 feet. 4,000. The number 2 engine, running at emergency power for 12 minutes now, began to shake. Chen watched the vibration gauge climb into the red zone. Metal fatigue. Something inside the engine, a rod bearing, a valve spring, a piston ring, was failing. 3,000 feet. 2,000. "Gear down," Fitzgerald ordered. Morrison hit the gear lever. The hydraulic system, barely functional, groaned. The landing gear extended with agonizing slowness. The left main gear locked. The right main gear locked. The nose gear extended halfway and stopped. Nose gears stuck. Morrison shouted. Fitzgerald didn't have time to care. The runway filled his windscreen. The crosswind pushed them right. He compensated left, using engine power, ailerons, and prayer. 1,000 feet. 500. Number 2 engine exploded. The connecting rod punched through the engine block, followed by a geyser of oil and flame. The propeller tore loose and windmilled away, tumbling end over end. The B-29 lurched, dropped, yawed violently right. 300 feet above the runway, Lonesome Lady was flying on one engine, no rudder, a stuck nose gear, and willpower. Fitzgerald's world narrowed to a single thought: put her on the ground. 100 feet. 50. The remaining engine was shaking itself apart, smoke pouring from the cowling. The runway rushed up. 20 feet. 10. The main gear touched concrete. The B-29 bounced, slammed down again, the nose gear collapsed, and the bomber's nose plowed into the runway in a shower of sparks and screaming metal. The aircraft slid, rotated, skidded sideways, the right wing digging into the ground. And stopped. For a moment, nobody moved. The silence was shocking after so many hours of engine noise. Then Fitzgerald's voice, hoarse and trembling: "Everybody out. Now." The crew scrambled through hatches, falling onto the runway, running, limping, crawling away from the wrecked aircraft. Fire crews surrounded the bomber, spraying foam. Fitzgerald was the last man out. He stood on the volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, staring at Lonesome Lady, his aircraft, his responsibility, his crew's salvation. Her nose was crushed. Her engines were destroyed. Her wings were shredded. But she'd brought them home. All 11 men alive.